Hello and welcome to Tisky Sour. Owen Jones is in the building.
Here he is. Hiya. How you doing,
How's it
buddy?
going?
Fine. I've got some non-alcoholic premium quality Heineken.
For Stoptober?
Yeah, but as you know, I was with you yesterday and I did have a little bit to drink, but I got a golden ticket. You're allowed to do that. Anyway, I'm not doing it for charity, so it's not... That makes me sound bad now. But I mean, I'm not violating some sacred
You probably get quite a bit
ritual.
for charity if you do it for charity.
Well, now I should have done that in hindsight, maybe.
I don't know, maybe.
Um,
Who knows?
But in any case, I've been pretty well behaved.
We are going to talk about the establishment off the leash,
Off the
and out of control.
They do leech.
They do leech, yeah.
Leeches.
Leeching off the leash.
Yeah.
But first of all, it was budget day today. So Philip Hammond has said the hard work of the British people is paying off and the era of austerity is finally coming to an end. Sounds pretty good. Is this a victory for the left, Owen?
In some ways it is, yes. I mean, the fact Theresa May said austerity is over was, I would say, a massive, colossal error. I mean, surprising from her. She's a master strategist. But it was a huge error because every cut now, to paraphrase the police, every cut you make, every
move you make, I'll be watching.
Yeah,
you.
that'll do. Everything now will be, those words will be hung around her neck with everything that happens. But if we think about in terms of the colossal, catastrophic failure of austerity as a project, even on its own self-described terms, whether it be the longest, most protracted squeeze in wages for working people of any industrialised country in the OECD of industrialised nations, other than Greece, the worst fall in wages, the most sustained fall in this country since the Napoleonic War, where the deficit, as we remember, was in solemn terms. The pledge was it would be wiped out by 2015. Philip Hammond now in 2018 is talking about it being reduced in the middle of the 2020s. Debt, they've added more debt than every single Labour government put together in history. And if we look now at the so-called commitments, take the NHS. The NHS has gone through the worst squeeze in funding as a proportion of the economy since it was founded. So the extra money doesn't even deal with that problem. Cuts to per pupil funding, to education, which I have to say is such an act of vandalism because clearly we'll be paying for that for generations. If you cut per pupil funding, you suffocate the potential of an entire generation, and as a country we'll be paying for that for many decades to come. In terms of social security, the cuts there, clearly most of George Osborne's cuts remain. So for low paid, for those in a country where most people in poverty are in work, their living standards will fall. Same with disabled people. Bear in mind, last year we had the biggest rise in child poverty since 1988. What I'd say, though, in terms of why there's a victory for the left, I think if I were to sum up the kind of dilemma, I'm going to be sympathetic about their dilemma. Neoliberalism has run out of road. And the dilemma they have is similar to what the left had in some ways in the 1970s when the post-war consensus had run out of road. Now, we would argue it should have gone in a different direction, clearly. But it had, in that form, run out of road in the 1970s after the oil shock, the collapse of Bretton Woods, the international financial framework. So that system was tottering. And what they're doing at the moment is flitting in quite an erratic way between going, well, look, the existing order, the current system, clearly is not working for millions of people. That's why, of course, amongst the working age population, Labour have a 20-point lead. Amongst, the younger you get, the Tories become a fringe party. So the Tories go, hang on a minute, we recognise that. We're going to have to recognise that. That's just reality here. So what we'll have to do is start conceding there are problems that have to be rectified. And Theresa May did try, the burning injustices she spoke of when she became Prime Minister. The danger with that, though, is you concede the argument to your opponents. You start to, you basically legitimise what they're saying. You come off as obviously conflicted, and people end up saying, well, why not have the full fat version? The other, which they flip towards, is we haven't made the case enough for free market ideology. We became too complacent, which they did. They were so triumphalist. They thought the left was battered, destroyed forever after the Cold War, after New Labour, which Margaret Thatcher called a big biggest achievement. And they said we should have carried on making the argument for free market dogma and ideology, and because we failed to do that, we surrendered. The Reds have taken over. The downside with that is they're going to double down on an ideology that's on a collision course with people's lived reality of a housing crisis, stagnating and falling wages, job insecurity, a worse lot in life for young people than their parents. So that's the dilemma. They keep flitting between the two. And the problem with the budget, where he talks, for example, of more spending, of getting rid of PFI, it is conceding arguments to Labour, but without the actual substance there. So the rhetoric Labour's rhetoric is being justified or legitimised. It shows the left is winning the battle of ideas. They have they run out of ideas. I was at Tory conference, spent a lot of time with some charming people, but they don't have any coherent ideas at all. All I found there was a kind of mania about the Reds are coming, the social, Venezuela and the Reds are under the beds, but there's no coherent ideology or set of ideas that exists there. And that's why it's just a flitting between let's scaremonger about the commies, but we are also going to start stealing in rhetoric some of their ideas but without any of the substance. So I think that's why this helps us, because we will be able to say from now on, having made the case austerity is a disaster, they've conceded it's unpopular, they're claiming it's over, people will spend the next few months and years realising it clearly isn't over, and Labour can, everything that happens from now on isn't just cuts that damage people's living standards, it's a broken promise from the Conservatives.
I mean, I agree they don't have any particular ideological framework carrying themselves forward. But I mean, I think what you can learn from Phillip Green's budget today, not Phillip Green, Philip Hammond, that's the next topic.
A lot of obnoxious Phillips.
Philip Hammond, is that he does have a coherent strategy. It's potentially not a good one, but the choice that they've made is that they're going to basically ease off on austerity, hopefully try and improve people's living standards a little bit, but they're going to try and do it without conceding they were mistaken. So that's why you get this line of the British public have done the hard work, they've put in the hard work. The only reason this sort of loosening of the fiscal strings is possible is because we did all of the sensible reforms over the last 8 years, and it was worth it that you had to tighten your belt for those 8 years. So it's sort of keeping with the ideology that austerity was necessary while saying the necessity of austerity is coming to an end. The question is just whether people buy that or not.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm sceptical about that amongst the working age population. I don't think that is the case. I mean, where that I think will land is, and I'm not going to generational conflict because Labour need to win over older people. That's why Labour didn't win the last election, principally because Labour remain a fringe party amongst older Britons. But older people have been protected. Social democracy has been preserved for older people, and their living standards on average have gone up since the crash. It's like the crash didn't happen. And that's who it will resonate amongst. But amongst the working age population, when wages are lower on average than they were before Lehman Brothers came crashing down, and where I think the argument which Labour putting forward is all of this pain, but what is there to show for it? That's what lands. And I think the problem is that's what, whether they like it or not, the Tories are de facto conceding. But we have to go hard on that as a failed experiment that has, they promised they'd wipe out the deficit over 3 years ago. They didn't. And then if we look at the NHS being reduced to a humanitarian crisis, according to the Red Cross last year, whether it be young people saddled with debt, whether it be per pupil funding cut for millions of parents across the country, whether it be stagnating wages, all of that then is seen as not a sacrifice in the name of some great noble successes and victories. In no sense is that tangible for people in this country, because there aren't any tangible successes. It's not like people can go, well, we've got the benefits of this austerity. What single benefit can anyone talk of over the last 8 years that has improved or changed their lives? And what will happen in the coming years is, because the Tories are promising that this is an end to something which is now very unpopular, support for increasing taxes to spend more is at the highest level now since 2002. Also, they're not benefiting anymore from what was the case, which really hurt us, particularly in the coalition years, was more people thought Labour was to blame for the cuts and the Conservatives. That's not the case anymore. The other, which
has that changed? I didn't know that.
That has changed. The other thing, though, that is we don't talk about enough, and I think this is worth remarking on, is particularly before 2015, 2016, the demonisation of social security and benefit claimants was so rampant, and George Osborne in particular was very much led on that campaign. That has subsided quite noticeably, and attitudes have shifted, and that's important because support or not support, resignation to austerity was often possible or made possible because it was portrayed as we're cutting back spending on the people who aren't deserving. The people who will suffer the pain are scroungers. They're people who, the state has subsidised their fecklessness, and they need to, this is for their own good, if anything, and that shifted as well. So I think that's why
because it started hitting middle class people, right?
Well, exactly.
So saw the Daily Mail launched recently a Save Our Parks campaign, which was all about how parks should have guards and how they should be open and maintained, and basically how they need to increase the funding massively to parks.
Well, we've had Conservative MPs, David Cameron at one point writing a letter to his council opposing specific cuts. So you've had Tory MPs doing that as well, kind of anti-austerity NIMBYism. And that's because obviously austerity, even with middle class voters, that has an impact. But when you have a situation where millions of low-paid workers or middle-income people are affected by cuts to social security, the idea of demonising, it's your scrounger next door, doesn't work. And also, people have seen the pain. I mean, when homelessness and rough sleeping goes up. So I think that's why there's been this shift, which is, I think the scapegoating, particularly of benefit claimants, has lost its salience. People's sense of, that sense of this is, I don't like it, but it's necessary, has massively declined, and there is a massive appetite for investing in the economy, the highest since 2002. So I think that's what Labour needs. There's a huge opportunity there, just because I think, if we bear in mind what we call Thatcherism did not start with Thatcher. It started under Jim Callaghan's Labour government in the 70s. After they went to the IMF, they imposed the worst cuts for many decades in government spending, which proved to be on the basis of Treasury forecasts, which were false. But what was called monetarism or Thatcherism began under Labour. So in a sense, did that help Labour? Well, of course it didn't. It helped legitimise and shore up Thatcherism. So the fact that even mildly toning down austerity, and in rhetoric certainly talking about austerity is something that needs to end, which then will collide with people's lived experience, I think is the flip of the 1970s, when we were losing the battle of ideas on every front. The difference is we did actually have ideas on the left at that point, on not the kind of people defending the post-war consensus, but there was a left arguing for an alternative economic strategy and so on. They don't really have that.
They have an alternative economic strategy, which is the Singapore one, right? Where you have low workers' rights, super low taxes, and then you make us all work for the wages that the Chinese do. Well,
the problem is that it's so monstrously ridiculously unpopular. I mean, that's the sort of thing which would get maybe 3% support. Libertarian right-wingery is a fringe position in the electorate.
We're going to move on to the other Philip in a second. First, I just want to get up one quote, which was just from the Guardian's report, that I thought was telling about how limited an end of austerity actually is. So it says, public services were promised an extra 1.2% a year starting in 2020. So it's not until 2020 we're going to get this, although officials subsequently stressed this was just a forecast. And this is after public services, the funding for them was contracted by 3% a year between 2010 and 2015, and 1.3% a year up to now.
And
so
bear
from
in mind
2015
then,
up to now. So you're not getting anywhere close to what funding for public services used to be. We're just not going to get any more budgets where it's more and more brutal cuts. We're basically now going to level out.
And what you end up there with as well, because you get rising need. I mean, this is the thing with the NHS, and it's not just that NHS spending has suffered a massive fall in increases. It's that there's a growing patient need because of a rising ageing population, because of cuts to social security, because of higher inflation of healthcare costs. So all of these, if you're promising a bit more funding for certain services in 2020, you wouldn't see the benefits of that till after 2020 anyway, the years afterwards. And in any case, it wouldn't reverse the damage done. And also you've got rising pressures on those services. So again, that's what we have to focus on. We have to focus on the promise, the pledge to end austerity. A consensus, we could then argue that austerity is innately a bad thing, that people do not want anymore. But the fact that the Tories promised something in rhetoric there, ideologically not able to deliver.
All right, the other Phillip Green. You've been personally reporting on this, haven't you?
I did. I don't want to sound like a dick, but I'm often. It's often said that I'm not a real journalist. I'm not bitter. I'm not a sensitive chap. It's fine. It's been, I've gotten so well with my peers in the media over the last few years. But I did this front page with a colleague of mine for The Guardian about Phillip Green, where a anonymous source got in touch about pretty horrendous, sickening allegations of how Phillip Green is alleged to behave, which, just alleged sexual harassment, alleged bullying, alleged racism. I think, Phillip Green is somebody, I think, who does sum up just the bankruptcy in so many ways of the British establishment and the British social order, which has governed this country for over a generation. He's a man who's, of course, venerated by prominent politicians. Tony Blair, who knighted him, who, he spoke of realising the British dreams and, that kind of promise of entrepreneurship. David Cameron, who appointed him as an advisor on public expenditure and so on. So he's, a man who's feted by politicians, by, almost presented as a case study as a British business, success story. And what's happened with Phillip Green? Well, it's not just the allegations of how he behaves in the workplace, and that speaks to me of, firstly, patriarchy, male dominance and male power and how that's exercised, male sense of entitlement, colliding with economic structures which concentrate vast amounts of power in the hands of economic titans who dominate our lives. And who believe they can behave as they see fit because there are no checks and balances on their authority.
Well, and also they can use their lawyers to ensure that they can behave as they see fit, right? I mean, that's the confusing part of the story. It's partly confusing because I know that journalists can't go on TV and say whatever they know and whatever they want because there's loads of legal restrictions about what people are allowed to say. But he basically made his employees, or some employees, sign non-disclosure agreements.
So the allegations we have, I have to be careful here, that's why I keep talking like this. So the allegations are that he spent, Arcadia even, not him personally, spent seven-figure sums on non-disclosure agreements to silence those who had allegedly come forward with allegations, including settlements of £3 million a pop. Two cases, 3 million, one 1 million, another 500,000. Vast amounts of money in order to silence alleged harassment and alleged bullying. I mean, Phillip Green himself, the reason, he sums up so much of this just decadent order is, so he took over BHS, which was this iconic British store. And even as it had this, he sold it off for he sold it off for £1 to a known bankrupt, a repeated bankrupt. And BHS, he'd taken hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends. It was then discovered afterwards there was a £500 million deficit in its pensions. Well,
there's an amazing symmetry to it all, which is why the story, well, obviously it's a terrible story, but it works so well because he leaves it with a £500 million deficit. He's taken in sort of like rent and earnings precisely £500 million in deficit. Well, it's 550 and 560, whatever. And it's exactly the same with Arcadia. So Arcadia currently has 1 billion pension deficit. In 2005 alone, he took 1.2 billion in dividends.
There you go.
For his family. So that was a record of the amount of money that an owner has ever sucked out of a business.
Yes, that's the key thing. He's somebody, I think, they're the 14th richest family in the country. They live this ridiculously opulent lifestyle. The key point, of course, is that the companies are actually technically owned by his wife based in Monaco, so they don't pay the taxes they would be otherwise eligible to pay as British taxpayers. So back in 2010, UK Uncut, the anti-tax avoidance campaigners targeted specifically his flagship stores like Tom. And indeed, one of those campaigners was Aaron Bastani, your Nirvana comrade, who appeared in the Daily Mail with his top off outside Topshop. Just, a little bit of little anecdote to Google it. It's there, all right. He's there with his top off. But anyway,
He's
it's
proud
impressive.
of that photo.
He certainly is. It was his profile picture for a long time. If I looked like that, it'd be my profile picture. But anyway, so this is somebody, we're talking about how it's one rule for some and one rule for others when it comes to who pays tax, because a local clothes store, a family-owned clothes business could not, or a local bookshop can't register themselves in foreign countries with lower tax regimes, or charge themselves for using their own logo and offset it as a cost, or sell their or reroute their sales through Ireland, or offload losses from foreign entities and put them on their balance sheets. They just have to pay their taxes, and they're often driven out of business by companies which do exploit those loopholes and can afford to do so. So you've got that whole kind of, at a time of massive austerity when we're told there's not enough money for basic public services, the likes of the Phillip Greens can avoid tax on an industrial scale, that they can just take over these companies, treat them as cash cows, get rid of them and give them to some known bankrupt who then obviously it goes bankrupt, massive gaping hole in its deficit, massive hole in its pensions, and these are deferred earnings. These are the deferred wages of workers who prop up these companies, who create the wealth of these companies. And then he's somebody, of course, alleged to have taken part in or be responsible for massive of alleged sexual harassment and bullying. So this is a story in lots of ways about our social order, the concentration of power and wealth in their hands. And when I talked about the establishment in the book, what I was talking about were the institutions and ideas that justify and legitimise the concentration of wealth and power in very few hands. And this ideology, if you like, we call neoliberalism, it binds them together. And when I wrote that book, it was still in the age of, it was still in the age of neoliberal hegemony, the different political era of 2014. When what united the establishment in this country was a sense of, and they were drunk of their own triumphalism, which has come to bite them now, but that idea on how you run and organise society seemed completely unchallenged and unchallengeable. And that enabled this, and they would popularise it. It's for the good of all society. What is good for Arcadia and Top Man and Top Shop is good for everybody else, which is self-evidently now a discredited idea. But I think that just sums up, the nexus of how it works. They had fawning media, they had fawning politicians. You had this revolving door, and you have that across the establishment, a revolving door of business, civil service, politics. To coin a phrase, they're all in it together.
So one thing I was wondering with the Phillip Green thing is, I suppose one of the reasons the establishment is supposed to be so successful is because the true nature of it is to some degree hidden. Whereas with Phillip Green, it's all so explicit, all so blatant, and in a way that's kind of unnecessary. He didn't need to take £500 million from BHS and leave a £500 million pension deficit. The guy's rich enough to not do that. He's got a £100 million yacht. And on the left, if you've got someone who's a figurehead on the left and they're behaving in such a way that it's completely discrediting your movement, there'll be a few people sort of like calling them up saying, come on, rein it in, what are you up to? Are there people calling Phillip Green at this point? Is George Osborne calling Phillip Green saying like, mate, can you just, you're giving this whole project a bad name, can you rein it in a little bit?
Let's start with George Osborne. No, just the other day, what was uncovered, it's not surprising, but George Osborne was told by civil servants that he was warned that his policies on social security would drive huge numbers of children into poverty. He's now a man who gets, all these baubles, these huge jobs from the British establishment. Here, have London's newspaper, despite monopoly newspaper nearly, the Evening Standard, despite having absolutely no background whatsoever in journalism. Here, have a job at BlackRock or whatever, these financial companies. These are people. He's somebody responsible for cynical partisan ends, in part, of plunging huge numbers of kids into poverty, who will suffer the consequences of that. But
I suppose, are there none with enough foresight to?
They're all. What I'm trying to say is they're all
psychopaths.
They're all so tainted by this. Who do you hold up? And that's another. You get the likes of Richard Branson. Because I wrote about this last week about philanthropy, and there was this argument because last year there was an unprecedented increase in the wealth of the world's billionaires, and this argument of, well, look at the philanthropy in motion, but what philanthropy does is make these, it's a convenient way of making these big businesses look good whilst they avoid far more in taxes. They arbitrarily decide themselves based on their own whims where the money goes, rather than on the basis of people's actual needs. And it also buys them influence, because if you're a philanthropist, then it gives you this kind of, confers you with a certain image, which buys you access with politicians and so on and so forth. I mean, that's the thing, the problem we have with, I suppose, the establishment is it's not a case of bad egg. I always get that metaphor wrong, because the whole point of a rotten apple is then the whole barrel becomes, then the whole barrel becomes rotten as a consequence. But it's not. It's about the system as a whole.
Oh, so you can do that. Let's take that metaphor further.
Yeah,
it is like bad apples, but they've been there for such a long time that all the other apples in the barrel
are just
rotten.
festered with maggots everywhere. Yeah, I mean, the whole point is it's not about... The establishment is not a story of villains. I mean, Phillip Green is useful as a case study, but it's not a case of the establishment is full of fundamentally bad people. Most people rationalise their behaviour as not being bad. Most people, like to think of themselves as, not damaging the rest of society. The issue with the establishment is not a case of if we replace a few bad people with people who behave well, then things will be improved. The establishment is a system, and the system is itself fundamentally bankrupt. And what we've seen in the last few years, quite dramatically, is that system has hit the buffers. It's run out of road, and the consequences in terms of stagnating living standards, in terms of the endemic insecurity, because what neoliberalism always did, which was that binding ideology of the establishment, the way it popularised itself wasn't going, oh yeah, we're going to make a load of wealthy people really wealthy and powerful. They obviously had to have a promise, a commitment to the rest of the population, and that was freedom. It was personal freedom. We will free you from the dead weight of the state. We will free you from the tyranny of collectivism, trade unionism, and so on. And the individual then will be free to prosper on their own merits. And this was then, it was a useful means of justifying inequality, because then you'd say the people at the top deserve to be there. They just worked harder. They're brighter. They're more intelligent. The people at the bottom are there because they're lazy and work shy. And that justified exploding inequality. But in practice, what human freedom or personal freedom they said they were expanding was actually lived as insecurity. It was, rather than, right to buy was sold off as you have the right to own your own home. But what did it mean in practice in the long term? It meant millions of people were denied the right to a decent, affordable home. A massive chunk of those houses were bought by buy-to-let landlords charging twice the rent of a council house. Job insecurity. There's 10 million people, it's estimated now, in insecure jobs in this country. So you got this sense of insecurity is not freedom. Mm-hmm. Insecuritism traps the individual. And I think that's what's hit the buffers, which is both people's anger and frustration with an establishment which continues, despite after over a decade now of the financial crash, continues to live as though it's having one non-stop party, which they are, whilst for millions of people life has become more difficult, where optimism has been sapped. And that, that's why the old order is fundamentally disintegrating in this country. We're
going to move to Brazil.
Oh yeah.
So yesterday, concerningly, Jair Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil. This is a guy who was, not only flirted with fascism, he's basically a fascist. We can get up some of the things he said to give us an idea of what kind of guy we're talking about. Obviously, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago on Tiski Sour, so you can check out a more in-depth story about Bolsonaro there. But for now, we'll just get up some of these quotes. So, Pinochet should have killed more people. This is in 1998. I have 5 children, 4 were boys. On the 5th, I got weak and had a daughter. That's in 2017. Let's shoot all the PT members here in Acre, which is a Brazilian state. So that's all the Workers' Party members, the main opposition at this point. My advice, and I do it, I cheat on my taxes as much as possible. If I don't need to pay anything, I don't pay. I'm favourable to torture, and you know this. That's in 1999. This is a guy who's a real threat to democracy, a real threat to human rights in Brazil. Owen, you tweeted today, which sort of created some controversy.
Last night, actually. I think it
was it last night? We can get that up. That the victory of Bolsonaro shows us that now more than ever, it's either socialism or barbarism. This upset a lot of people. What did you mean by this?
Upset the usual people. I think. What we saw. Look, if we just think of where we're at, and I think this is an important point to make. So the biggest democracies in the world are India, the United States, Indonesia, and then Brazil. 3 of those 4 now are led by either, or are to be led by an overt fascist like Bolsonaro, or by leaders which are sympathetic to and supported by fascists. In India, Modi; in the United States, Donald Trump. So, this is a period, an era of profound crisis. I mean, Bolsonaro is the most acute example of this, and one that should particularly horrify us. I mean, the way I look at it is, these are the morbid symptoms of a decaying global social order. And what happened in Brazil is, if we look actually, despite his flaws, Lula, according to all the former president of Brazil, Workers' Party, from the left, had to made lots of compromises in power, but from the left, all the polls showed he would have won in this election, but he was stitched up by an establishment which undertook a soft coup against his successor back in 2016, which was backed by a lot of so-called centrists in Brazil. Centrist so-called parties collapsed in this election, but their leading politicians took a position of neutrality between what was effectively a moderate social democrat and a fascist. I mean, the point I would make is, look, I mean, it's just to take a step back at where we are. In the 90s, so-called third-way politics was hegemonic across much of the Western world. So you had the Clintons in the White House, Blair, of course, here in Britain, Leonard Jospin in France, Gerhard Schröder in Germany, the Spanish Socialists, the Dutch Labour Party, across the Nordic countries as well. They all had kind of the third way with their own particular local characteristics, because in Britain neoliberalism had gone much further than elsewhere, so they weren't all the same, but they were fundamentally rooted in a similar tradition. That tradition has no relevance to the post-crash era in which we live, of social and economic turmoil. Centrist-led social democratic parties are in a state of, in some cases, political liquidation in much of continental Europe. They're in collapse. They're getting their worst polling since the war, from Germany to Italy to Spain, even though now there's a left-wing government which is backed by the radical left Podemos party, the Netherlands, we could go on, and in the United States, where you got kind of centrist Democrat par excellence, Hillary Clinton. Even though she won the popular vote, that was an election which was deemed, an asteroid hitting Earth would have been more likely than Donald Trump becoming president, which just showed the utter complacency of a centrist Democratic Party who just did not understand, the social and political trends around them, or had no answer to them because of their own ideology. And we've seen again, of course, Brazil succumb to fascism, and this is the most dramatic example. And for me, I think, we look back to, history. It's said often doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And this is not the 30s just being imported. Well, I certainly hope not, because in the 30s and 40s, fascism overwhelmed Europe and much of the world with the deaths of tens of millions of people. But the echoes are striking. And at a time of economic and social crisis, people do not want the system to be tinkered with or to be managed. They want it to be overhauled in a dramatic fashion. If we don't offer a convincing and coherent alternative, then fascism and the far right will fill that vacuum. And I think that is a phenomenon which is happening across much of the world at the moment.
So I suppose responses to that tweet, because I'm pointing out not just because I think what happened on Twitter today is the most important thing that happened this weekend, but because there are some interesting points to be made there. So one is that there are other options: liberalism, centrism, whatever. I think you've just addressed that. The other is something that Paul Mason was talking about a couple of weeks ago in the New Statesman, which I thought was quite interesting, about 2 alternate strategies that the left can have in response to a rising far right. So one is the sort of socialism or barbarism angle, which is to say the only way to challenge the far right is with a properly socialist platform, an uncompromising socialist platform, and we see bourgeois liberals as a liability. So he cites Marx in 1848 telling French revolutionaries, throw the bourgeoisie overboard as their untrustworthy allies. So it's this idea that, we don't want anything to do with the centrists because they'll corrupt our movement, and then that will make us even weaker as we're trying to face the far right, because they'll sell us out. He then talks about another tradition on the left, which is the Popular Front against fascism. So he's saying this was the strategy of the Communist International in the 1930s, where you're saying we as socialists will work with anyone who will stand against fascism with us. And that will sometimes mean persuading people who were sort of somewhat teetering. So you're trying to divide the liberal bourgeoisie to try and bring into your camp those people who you think you can fight with against fascists. And I wonder how you see your stances relating to those two positions on the left. And I suppose a further question would be, if you were to be in favour of the Popular Front, should we be spending more time love-bombing centrists instead of trying to dismiss their politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Paul Mason, as ever, that was a very stimulating article. He's always exceptionally thought-provoking on anything he writes about. I think, I suppose the quick summary of those positions, again, just in the past, was the Marxist understanding of the bourgeoisie, of the rising capitalist industrialist class, was they played originally a revolutionary role in emancipating humanity from feudalism and semi-feudalism, the French Revolution and so on, the Napoleonic conquest of much of Europe. And then that role became obsolete, and they've ended up becoming buffers on human progress, which needs to be superseded. That role, that now a reactionary role, and that Lenin and Trotsky. Well, Trotsky, he had this theory of permanent revolution, which was outside of the industrialized developed world, the bourgeoisie was actually too weak to play that revolutionary role, and actually that fell to the working class to do the democratic bourgeois bit, parliamentary democracy and so on, and then go, but not to stop there, but to continue to socialism, because in that division of Russian Marxists, you had the Mensheviks, who believed, if you like, with quite a crude Marxist interpretation, that you had to be an advanced capitalist state to have a socialist revolution, because you needed a massive working class. In Russia, most were still peasants, and therefore you needed to go through a period of you could have a reformist government that tried to ameliorate the excesses of capitalism, but until then you couldn't have socialism until you had an advanced capitalist state. I mean, in terms of what then happened with Stalinism, is originally from the 1920s onwards, as fascism grew in Italy, and then obviously in Germany, originally it was so-called third period Stalinism, which was as ultra-sectarianism, and saw social democrats as social fascists and enablers of fascism. And then you had this quite abrupt shift to the so-called Popular Front, where you didn't just make communist parties, shouldn't just make alliances with social democrats, but also liberals. I think what I'd say in terms of our current context and where we are now, that I don't have any aversion to making alliances against fascism with social democrats or so-called centrists. The problem, I think, is these, which is on what terms? Because often the problem with so-called centrism is it will accept an alliance on the basis that it assumes a leadership role and you surrender your key ideological tenets to their leadership. They themselves to be a centrist, which doesn't really describe a kind of coherent ideology. Many of those so-called centrists, historically they principally define themselves against the left. When they assumed leadership, for example, of the Labour Party, that was because they saw themselves as having waged a successful and often quite brutal civil war against the left flank of the Labour Party, who they fundamentally believed, there had to be a year zero of the Labour Party where their political tradition should be permanently vanquished, which they thought they'd achieved. So you still see that now with so-called centrists. They will regard the Labour left as a bigger threat often. I mean, it depends on the centrists, that's why you can't really homogenise them. But there are some so-called centrist commentators and centrist MPs who would prefer Theresa May to be Prime Minister than Jeremy Corbyn. What do you do in that circumstance? I mean, a premiership which legitimises far-right tropes, which sent go-home vans around mixed communities, which expelled Black Britons under the Windrush scandal, which, you know, in terms of its anti-migrant rhetoric and Islamophobia. So you get some centrists who will go, they'll say they don't agree with that or whatever, but fundamentally they see the Labour left as a bigger threat. So what do you do in that circumstance? Are we the ones being sectarian? And the other, I suppose, is the danger is if we end up having to surrender a lots of or to put on hold what we regard as the solutions to a broken system. Well, our analysis is the far right is a morbid symptom of a decaying system, which I'm afraid centrists were complicit in propping up and justifying, whether it be not regulating the financial sector, whether it be not dealing or reversing properly the massive inequality of the Thatcher era, or properly dealing with the massive housing crisis and abdicating it to the market. And what worries me a bit is what I call kind of the Berlusconi model, which is that when Berlusconi became leader of Italy, prime minister, that was a huge shock to people, obviously, of a progressive disposition in Italy. This thuggish, demagogic right-wing politician who basically owned 90% of the Italian broadcast media. I mean, they were utterly horrified. And the argument ended up being that leftists needed to dampen down their radicalism. There needed to be this grand coalition, and basically the way of defeating it was centrist moderation, which the Italian Democrats, which had come out of the Italian Communist Party, summed up. They became this, new Labour, but without a trade union link. So without even that kind of counterweight. Look what's happened to Italy now. You know, that ended in a period of economic and social crisis with a centrist formation, which the left had subordinated themselves, unable to answer the massive social problems that afflicted Italy, including stagnating living standards and so on. And instead that was filled by two different forces. The Five Star Movement, a really bizarre hodgepodge populist movement led by an eccentric comedian, and the Northern League, a semi-fascist organisation who are now in government in Italy. And the Italian Democrats, like most centrist-led centre-left parties, has got a massive drubbing at the last elections. So that's my worry. I mean, my other worry, again, I look at Brazil. In Brazil, those centrist leaders sat out an election between a fascist and a moderate social democrat. And, the Guardian's excellent Latin America correspondent, Tom Phillips, said what you can imagine what just happened in Brazil's election is it was like Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I don't think Haddad, the Brazilian Workers' Party person, was wasn't like Corbyn, but was from a left party, versus Nick Griffin and Tony Blair. It was like Tony Blair in the Brazilian context saying, I'm going to sit this one out and be neutral. So I suppose those are the problems that have to be addressed. I think clearly we have to find ways of building broad alliances. But I would say is, when we talk about that, what do so-called centrist politicians have a massive organic base in this country? I mean, obviously we need to build a mass movement on the streets, in our workplaces and in our communities. But it clearly, when we talk about forming alliances with centrists, I presume people don't mean Tony Blair or Nick Clegg.
Well, I think what Paul Mason is talking about, so the quote is, the number one lesson with regard Bolsonaro's rise is, I quote, to try as hard as possible for as long as possible to maintain an alliance between the centre and the left. So it's not necessarily to say that an alliance with the centre because it has this moral or democratic legitimacy. It's to say that, or at least in Brazil, once you lose any remnants of a liberal bourgeoisie, it becomes much harder to win because of the power they exert in society, that's the problem. I mean, legitimately or illegitimately.
But we know, obviously now the stock markets and so on in Brazil are soaring, and we know, I mean, as the BBC keeps reporting, big business is absolutely delighted. I mean, the national Canadian broadcaster did a series of tweets about what great news this was for potential Canadian investors. So I don't know much we can do about that in this era. I don't think we're going to compete. Obviously, I'm not saying you or Paul are suggesting this about being who can be the most pro-business, because we're not going to win that battle. And if we did, we've lost our entire project and worldview, and then we won't be able to satisfy the grievances which are then fed on by fascism. So we will lose in every sense. We will, but we will be politically and morally bankrupt, and then we will lose our any any basis in society. So what I'd say is, of course, we should make alliances against fascism and the far right, but we do need to do it on our own political terms. We do need to. There is, unless we have radical solutions to the radical injustices, from housing to falling wages to young people having a worse lot in life than their parents, unless we have, or just the collapse of market ideology, unless we have coherent responses to those things, then the far right will fill the vacuum. People do not want tinkering. They don't want a broken system to be tinkered with. They are receptive across the West to those promising a radical break from the status quo. If we end up becoming politically timid or presenting ourselves as such and dampening down the radical solutions needed, then we will be outflanked in rhetoric by extremist right-wing zealots who will scapegoat migrants and Muslims for all the injustices caused by the people at the top. So yes, let's form those alliances, but if we end up conceding political ground on those terms, then we won't, we will actually help bolster the far right, because they will be able to present themselves as the anti-system political force. And as soon as we've learned that, the problem, take France, it was the French socialists actually elected what on their terms was, or selected as their candidate, Benoît Hamon, who was on the left of the socialists. And he got a drubbing in the presidential election. He got 6%, whilst Mélenchon, who stood as another radical left candidate with François Insoumis, stood independently of the socialists. And the problem is Hamon not only had the socialist establishment turning on him anyway and saying everyone vote Macron, don't vote for this guy, but he was dragged down by the baggage of the socialists in power. He was presented as being a pro-system politician, which wasn't actually fair. But that's not the issue. It's as soon as you are seen as a pro-system politician, rather than an anti-system politician, then you have helped create the political conditions of which the far right can exploit and even succeed. And that's in Brazil. The Workers' Party look to many people like part of a corrupt establishment. They were in power for 16 years. There were lots of problems with huge corruption. Also, police violence continued, and let's not glorify those years. They did do social reforms which lifted huge numbers of Brazilians out of poverty. They did big housing projects. But nonetheless, there were still these huge problems in Brazilian society, which the far right have managed to tap into. But I don't see how it's possible. I mean, when we talk about forming an alliance with centrists, I just, in our own context, I don't know what that would look like, or how we would do it without surrendering politically in some fundamental ways.
Should we be love bombing Remain, whilst maintaining our leftist principles that we think are the solutions the country needs and that we think are the policies that could win an election in this point? Should we be doing more to try and love bomb? Which, I mean, that's the most obvious sort of like liberal bloc. The most obvious liberal social bloc in Britain is the people who are on the People's Vote March.
Well, I think we need to be warmer partly to... I think if we look at the People's Vote March, of course there were those who were, basically... think everything was going all right or was generally okay before 2016. This kind of, and you get that from certain centrist so-called leaders who, like Anna Soubry or but even others on the centrist Labour side who basically, think fundamentally this was a time of relatively good governance, stability. Well, it wasn't if you were disabled or low paid or suffering the brunt of conservative austerity. So you do get those, but I actually don't think that's the case with a huge number of people who went on that march. I think a lot of them are well disposed towards Labour, voted Labour at the last election, and if you ask them, support things like, hiking taxes on the rich, public ownership of utilities, getting rid of tuition fees and all the rest. And they don't like Brexit. Most Labour voters do not like Brexit. Most Labour members, well, even more Labour members, don't like Brexit. They see it fundamentally as a reactionary, hard-right Tory project, which is mixing xenophobia and a desire to have a race to the bottom in terms and conditions, which under the Conservatives is what Brexit is. I mean, there's no point pretending otherwise. So we've got to understand that and be empathetic. The issue has always been, how does Labour deal with reconciling a result its leadership did not want with the fact that, that 80% of Hackney voted Remain and 70% of Hull voted Leave, and they're both Labour heartlands that they need to bring together. With the fact that in the last election, the only seats Labour lost were 6 Leave seats, like Mansfield and Stoke-on-Trent South, and the fact that a lot of Leave seats, or some Leave seats, went from safe Labour seats to marginals, like Ashfield, for example. That Labour can't win without a coalition of Remainers and Leavers, and that means understanding the anger lots of Remain Labour voters have, accepting things like a customs union, and also at the same time opposing the xenophobia unleashed by the Tory wing of the Brexit project, but also having to deal with the fact that we lost the referendum. And also, I speak as somebody, I'm like most people on the radical left, deeply, profoundly critical of the EU in its current formation, and believe, like the likes of Podemos in Spain are arguing for radical reform and restructuring of the EU. There are some, of course, who don't believe that's possible and just believe we should leave. But anyway, a left exit from the European Union, a Lexit, was not on offer in the last referendum. But I think what Labour have to do is just, it's a very difficult political situation, but I actually think they've balanced it quite well, which is to oppose consistently, despite the conspiracy theories or myths propagated by some of the centrist so-called Remain figures. That
I love your commitment to calling them so-called.
Well, it's just like, because they obviously mean that as moderate and all the rest of it, and most people think they're centrist.
I suppose, they don't get to claim the centre ground, is what you mean.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, because
we shouldn't concede the centre ground to these guys.
Because most people don't think in terms of left or right, and if they're asked, they're like, "Well, I'm just a reasonable guy, I'm moderate. I'm a centrist." What we mean by centrist is normally, you accept a lot of the neoliberal project in some form or other, and you don't
socially liberal, fiscally conservative.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, and I just think Labour have to have that what is often an impossible balancing act, which is to try and negotiate that referendum result with also dealing with the injustices which caused people to vote for Brexit in the first place. And I think that's the thing with so-called centrists. I'm going to keep calling them that. They hate it. But you can't call them anything without them kicking off. If you call them a Blairite, they think, you've gone up to their mum and told them to F off or something. But I mean...
they just want to be called centre-left, don't they? But we're not going to concede that to them either.
It's not going to happen. Try it, won't happen. But what I find striking about them is they behave... or their understanding of politics is so limited because they behave as though the crash never happened. So they behave as well as a lot of them as though the whole world has just gone mad. They pathologise it. They're the only sane ones left standing. Much of the rest of Britain has just succumbed to hysteria and extremism. They've been lied and conned by nefarious political interests on different sides. And they don't have any understanding of... So I saw this tweet by a former Labour advisor. Oh, no, not a Labour advisor, a Labour staffer, talking about the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony, and how I'm going to watch that and just wonder how did it all go wrong. And you just kind of think, that was 4 years after a massive financial crash, where austerity was unleashed 2 years earlier, where living standards have fallen for the longest period since the Napoleonic War, where public services has been slashed up. I mean, we could go on, where social security has been decimated for so many people, and it's just this kind of bafflement about what has happened around them, and that they don't understand that political crisis is obviously a symptom of wider, broader social and economic convulsion in this country, and that's what I just find so bizarre. It's that sense of bafflement of what's happening, and their understanding of politics is just pre-crash. It's as though the crash just simply did not happen, and therefore, a lot of them have become what they always said about the left, which was defined by what they're against, not what they're for, stuck in the past, obsessed with the so-called golden era, looking for traitors, not converts. That has been often the habits of some of us on the left at various points, but they have become like that, and it's that they have this total lack of political curiosity. And the difference is, when we were like that, the left was just a marginal political force. We weren't in charge of the Labour Party, but we didn't have a sense of entitlement because we didn't have any influence or connections, particularly within the British media. So we were just this...
We didn't have 50% of the PLP.
No.
And the phone numbers of all the comment editors at The Guardian, The Times, The Independent.
A lot of them.
The FT.
Every BBC producer.
Yeah. It's question time, so get your questions in as you're thinking of those, as you're typing them down. I'm going to tell you what I always tell you, which is if you are enjoying this show, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tech wizard Gary was doing some analytics the other day. He found out that only half of the people that watch this live are subscribed to our YouTube channel. I don't know what's going on there. You will get updates every time we go live if you subscribe to the Novara Media YouTube channel, and it helps us grow. Also, please like this video. As I said last week, not for my affirmation, but so more people see it. And third thing, of course, Novara Media is only possible because of the support of you guys. We are primarily volunteer run and don't have any advertising. So we exist purely on the basis of your subscriptions. As you know, we are asking for 1 hour's wage, or the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can keep working around the clock. Let's get these questions in. Right. Oh, this is a miserable one.
Oh, hello.
Stuart Perry Hughes. Owen, too late for Brazil. Which is the next country we should be worrying about?
Oh, that's cheerful, isn't it? Which is the next country we should be worrying about? I mean, a lot of them. I mean, obviously, in Germany, the alternative for Deutschland in polls now has supplanted the SPD as the main opposition party, and I mean that we can expect that to grow. I think in France, the danger is with Macron, who's often seen as, you know, by centrists the king prince over the water. But who, you know, let's not forget, in the first round of the presidential elections, the top four candidates all got quite a similar result, relatively speaking, crowded between about 20 and 25%. And the vast majority of people voted for Macron to stop Le Pen. All the polling shows that. He's now catastrophically unpopular. The danger in France is not just the reconstituted far-right National Front. It's that the so-called centre-right Gaullists have shifted dramatically to the right and have started to co-opt that agenda, so we should be worried about that. I mean, Italy, clearly, the far right are already in power, but the polling shows they're very popular in Italy, so we could, the fear there is that could shift even further to the right. I think, I mean, in Latin America, I mean, in Argentina, it's they have a right. I mean, that's actually the right wing regime there is pretty unstable at the moment. But you know, it's interesting in Latin America, which suffered initially some of the worst successes of neoliberalism. So it wasn't a surprise that it became the first continent with any significant break from neoliberalism. But the pendulum generally there has shifted, not entirely, because obviously in Mexico, which is the other major, you know, Brazil and Mexico, the two biggest Latin American nations, the left for the first time in Mexico for decades has won the presidency. But I would say, I think those are places particularly. I mean, Eastern Europe, Hungary continues to degenerate in terms of, you know, I've been there to interview dissidents. It becomes an ever more authoritarian right-wing regime. Poland, despite some hiccups in recent regional elections, the Polish hard right authoritarian government continues to chip away at democracy. Austria, the far right. I mean, this is a bit depressing.
Yeah, you don't have to go through every country where something bad's going to happen. Right, Rhubarb has asked. Again, it's not the most chirpy of questions. Has politics become more violent, adversarial today?
I suppose my only caution there is when you get this sometime false comparison between the left and or the sense of lefties being rude on Twitter to the right wing in Britain. Well, the right in Britain, the right run the British media largely, and they have front pages saying things like enemies of the people, traitors, saboteurs, mutineers, to describe not just their opponents but just mild critics or those they see as a roadblock to their ideology. We obviously have a growing fascist terrorist movement. We've had the murder of a Labour MP by a fascist terrorist. We had a fascist terrorist who killed who launched an attack on a mosque with his truck, who came to London saying he wanted to kill Jeremy Corbyn as a terrorist supporter and Sadiq Khan as a bonus. We've obviously had in America, we've had the far-right murder of Jews in a synagogue, far-right terrorist who sent letter bombs to critics of Trump. So there's no equation. I just think sometimes there's a case of there are various lefties being rude on Twitter, and the difference is, to hard right or right wing discourse, where the conservatives could talk about their opponents as illegitimate, as extremists, as terrorist supporters, agents of foreign regimes, with the likes of Sajid Javid, who's a possible future Tory leader, describes Momentum as a neo-fascist organisation. And then lefties on social media, because that's one of the only forums the left can actually talk freely and organise and have a platform, being a bit rude, and that's seen as a false equivalence. I think the other thing I'd say on that, though, is a lot of the anger you see on social media isn't because of, it's this sense of what happened to Twitter, why has it gone so angry? You get this all the time. I think is just politics has polarised because of social and economic crisis. It started in Scotland, that was the kind of foreshadow, the referendum there. Again, a near miss with independence, and that had so much to do often with people voting. I didn't agree with independence, but they were voting often against a rotten system. Then, of course, the Labour's internal civil wars and Brexit, and those are all symptoms of the fact that, of course, people are angry about their deteriorating living conditions and standards, and the fact that that's robbed them of optimism, and that can manifest itself in anger. But I don't think it's a sense of people have suddenly just become less polite and how outrageous that is. I think that's just a sense of, if you get a social and economic crisis, as we've gone through now for over a decade, that will have political consequences, and that anger will go in lots of different directions. But it's a liberal fallacy to compare anger of the left and the right. It's like Mitt Romney, he said, the US Republican, he said, you've got those on the left you've got those on the right who scapegoat immigrants, and those on the left who scapegoat bankers. So bankers did plunge the country and the world into an economic calamity.
It's not a protected characteristic.
No, exactly. It's not like, obviously immigrants didn't. Immigrants haven't objectively caused these problems. And obviously injustice is not like the weather. It doesn't just happen. There are people, agents responsible for causing injustice. So it's not like, obviously there are people to blame for things going bad, but you have to blame the right people. Is being angry at bankers and politicians who were linked to them and facilitated what happened, is that justifiable? Yes. Is anger at immigrants because there isn't enough housing or enough jobs justifiable? No. And that's why you can't equate different forms of anger as though all anger is just bad in the abstract.
This is an interesting question. Will Eden, how could a Corbyn government challenge the Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world?
I think Corbynism has already done. If you look, for example, in the US, what we've seen is a kind of positive feedback loop between the US and the British left. So they're learning from each other's ideas and strategies. There's some personal overlap, frankly, from both sides. You've had some people in the Bernie campaign who came to work on. Who've come to work with Momentum and the Corbyn project generally. And I think what Corbynism has done, if we think particularly across Europe where social democracy is in crisis, where various social democratic parties are collapsing, and what was happening was, what's happening with social democracy, it's crumbling in three main different directions. New movements of the left, the xenophobic and nativist right, and civic nationalist parties. And that was what was happening to Labour in 2015, to UKIP, to the Greens, and to the Scottish National Party. And in 2017, that went into reverse. So what that's done is offer a coherent alternative, which can be a block to the rise of the far right across Europe and in America. So a lot of the left are looking correctly, because if you were supported the German Social Democrats and on 15% in the opinion polls, whilst the far right have more support than you, or the Dutch Labour Party or elsewhere, seeing a party which didn't win the last election, as we're endlessly told, but got 40% of the vote after 2 years after one of its worst post-war defeats, that offers an alternative in strategy. If that wasn't there, imagine what we'd be going through the same thing, and there would be almost nothing as an alternative example. So I think the fact it's giving the US and the European left an alternative, and if it comes to power, and it will face huge opposition and problems, but being in power and being able to succeed will embolden those movements across the world. And I think that's the best it can do in those situations.
I'm rephrasing the question, but from Nicholas Dara, what did you learn from Slavoj Žižek? Who you spoke to earlier in the week in a Guardian interview, which you can watch on your YouTube channel.
I learned And I tried to replicate this in this, is just to speak really, really fast and just stop anybody else.
You don't do the nose thing, though. I think that would have really helped.
I think he had a cold that day, so it was even more acute.
No, he's been doing that for decades.
He has, yeah. What did I learn?
Do you agree? He said, so the controversial thing from that interview was Hillary's the problem, not Trump, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't... Well, I mean, Clinton's talking about running again, which would be a disaster. I mean, for me, Clinton, Clintonism, should we say, or the centrist Democrats, their problem is, one of their key problems is they allow Trump to happen, but obviously Trump is a far bigger calamity. You know, the idea in that election, you just, as some did, a very few vocal, very vocal small minority, treat, Trump and Clinton as though you sit it out. I mean, I backed Sanders, like everyone on the left. And I don't like what Clintonism has to offer or what it represents. But obviously you can't equate the two, and Trumpism is a horrific threat to to basic progressive norms. So no, I don't agree with that. No, that's Clintonism, obviously, whether it be support for imperialist wars, which we've had under Trump. We got an escalation of bombing raids in Iraq and Syria, which he promised gloves off. That's what happened. There was a huge increase in civilian deaths as a consequence. His warmongering with Iran. So this idea you got amongst some that actually Clinton was the real warmonger and Trump wasn't was just farcical, because yes, admittedly, under a Clinton presidency there would have been warmongering, there would have been military interventions, as there were under previous Democratic presidents, Vietnam and so on. But the idea you can equate what would have been two warmongering presidents, one of which has legitimised the growing far right, not just in America, the rest of the world. It's just I find that a bit infantile.
Neither Clinton nor Trump.
I think that's
neither Clinton nor Trump, but you liberals, if you're willing to get behind a proper social democratic campaign, social democratic politics, get on board. We'll love from you.
Exactly. Amen to that. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they'll respond if Sanders becomes the Democrat nominee. Will the centrist Democrats rush behind him in a presidential election, enthusiastically backing him? It is going to be an interesting one because a lot of the client and donor.
I mean, they didn't do that with Corbyn, did they?
No, but can you imagine in America the difference is the Democrats aren't, they're not a social democratic party. They're not a party organically linked to the trade union movement. Their donor base is corporate America. It's like Silicon Valley and liberal, multi-billionaires and people in the digital economy. These are not people who want a social democratic government, which is what Sanders would offer if he got enough of. I mean, then he'd have the he'd have Congress to deal with as well. No, I mean, it would be fascinating to see those who criticise people on the left and not enthusiastically enough backing Clinton. What would they do if Sanders was the nominee? I doubt they will be enthusiastically out there cheering him on, but we'll see if he gets it.
Owen Jones, thank you for joining me tonight.
Yeah,
always a pleasure.
Right back at you.
Consistent friend of the show.
Yeah, loving it.
Thank you for watching. This was Tisky Sour. We are Navarra Media. As I've already said, but I'm going to say it again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like this video. Keep commenting. I'm enjoying them. And subscribe to Navarra Media. It's you guys that make this possible. So we'll see you next Monday. Good night.